My research attempts to advance the understanding of the correlation between the rentier state and authoritarianism in post-revolutionary Iran, specifically in the administration of Khatami. So there are a couple of concepts here, the authoritarian state, rentier economy, which I will try to kind of cover as I go along. The 1997 election of Khatami provided a political opportunity for change and opening, recognized as the revival of the student movement after the revolution. To understand how a state cursed by oil revenues could experience instances of uprising and demand for change, we need a rigorous typology that can describe indicators of authoritarianism in Iran. To understand the relation between these concepts, I look into state structures, actor-based policies, and also the civil society. So these three, state structures, civil society, and also actors and voluntarism are the three angles that I'm going to look at when I try to find the correlation between authoritarianism and the rentier state. There's also the transnational aspect, which I will not look into just for the purpose of time. Investigating these three elements that synthesize both the political structure and the socioeconomic relations of consumers and collectors of rent will offer a clearer depiction of change within continuity in the Islamic Republic. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many scholars predicted that the Middle East would also embrace democracy. However, Middle East did not follow these predictions exactly, and ever since, this region has become the focal point in studying the persistence of authoritarianism in the field of political science. But authoritarianism is not a particular phenomenon to the Middle East, but it is the endurance and the density of it in some of the Middle Eastern countries that makes the region an interesting subject of analysis. Authoritarianism was generally considered a stagnant condition in the case of these countries, and therefore they were left out of most important studies on democratic transitions in the developing world literature. However, I have to emphasize that, again, authoritarianism is not specific to the Middle East, and well-coded data from the Freedom House, the 2015 data that they just released, says that in general countries have stepped back in terms of indicators of freedom in general. So it's not just the Middle East. Again, scholarly attention has been paid to the analysis of non-democratic regimes, but the field lacks the needed attention to theories about authoritarian policies. This scarcity of work is even more noticeable when compared to the plethora of work on democratization in recent decades. Due to the hopefulness and normative commitment to democracy in the 1980s and 90s, scholars underestimated the possibility that a transition from authoritarian rule could lead to anything but a democratic regime. This is while scholars who established the transition framework concluded that transition from authoritarian rule could lead to democracy, authoritarian regression, revolutions, or hybrid regimes. Initial studies tried to explain why some countries became democratic and why some didn't, based on macro structural variables like socioeconomic development and corresponding cultural change that fostered democratic politics. But this is not a complete explanation. In other words, and I'm using the words of Michael McFall, inert, invisible structures do not make democracies or dictatorships. People do. Structural factors such as economic development, cultural influences, and historical institutional arrangements influence the formation of actors' preferences and power. But ultimately, these forces have causal significance only if translated into human action. So this emphasis on actors, agency, and voluntarism focuses on individual choices as central drivers of human action. So the structural approaches that characterize the first kind of approach to transitions need to be synthesized with the second, more voluntarist, actor-based approach.
So in my presentation, I will focus on the mass protests which took place in Turkey in the summer of 2013, the so-called Gezi events, named after the park in the heart of the city that masses rose up to defend. The Gezi events consisted of a set of complex protests, forms of action, mobilization of ideologies and emotions. In simple words, Gezi protesters diversified into a wide range of sociopolitical and cultural backgrounds. LGBTQ people, feminists, anti-capitalist Muslims, secularists, nationalists, minorities such as Kurds, environmentalists, Marxist socialists, communists, anarchists, and many other groups which do not fit in any category fought shoulder to shoulder to save the park from greedy capital. In the light of this fact, I will locate the Gezi movement as a recent example of anti-globalization struggles of 21st century. As a non-aligned eco-protester who went to the park before the mass protests broke out and witnessed how the first initial resistance evolved into civil disobedience, I consider Gezi as an affective event. I will unpack what I mean by this, but let me briefly summarize the political context and structural conditions that produced this unexpected event. In a similar fashion as seen in other cases in the developing world, the 1980 military coup in Turkey had gradually undermined the import substitution industrialization economic structure through which the leftist Marxist bloc, along with the unionist movements, made unimaginable gains in the political realm through the late 1970s. This economic model was also compatible with country's founding ideology, Atatürkism, with its emphasis on solidarist developmentalism. The coup administration purged the political spectrum of the leftist elements. Turkey in neoliberal era was exposed to immense fragmentation, volatility, ephemerality in cultural and material life. In an enigmatic way, neoliberal transformations had both progressive and regressive implications. The dissolution of orthodox Marxist organizations and the self-critique of the left in general led to the crystallization of new left movements. The arrival of late capitalism was accompanied by the new political parties in the parliament, which surfaced along with crystallizing identities. The political Islam, embracing free market principles, and the Kurdish movement arose as the competing agents against Atatürk's republican ideology, which lost its momentum after the coup. The oscillations of global capital in parallel with the political power shifts in local contexts have manifested itself over Istanbul's urban space as well. The notion of selling the city as a financial and touristic center with its ancient history arose in the early 1980s. With this logic on mind, the liberal and conservative mayors of Istanbul, including the current President Erdogan, built big boulevards along the historical peninsula and the Bosphorus. High rises of financial district and condos built through accumulation by disposition have changed the face of the city for the last couple of years. Massive urban projects involving large-scale investments have accompanied this dynamism in the house market. One of the implications of these transformations, I would suggest, is the shrinking of public spaces. To add the fact of migration issue to this picture, I would describe Istanbul as a city caught up in the vortex of hyper-capitalism. This whirling mass has become more potent, especially after AKP's unchallenged political hegemony. The party's last urban redevelopment project, the restitution of the 19th century Ottoman artillery barrack as a shopping mall and a hotel complex in Gezi Park, sparked the insurrection on 31 May. There were a few activists, graduate students, small environmentalist groups, and members of Chamber of Architects and city planners who had occupied the park for 4 days prior to the insurrection night. Cops forcefully tried to evict this group, which I view as multitude. Subsequently, images began circulating in and through media outlets and social media. The image of woman in red being pepper sprayed by the police notably went viral. I would argue that this shot, which later became the colored symbol of the Gezi protest, ignited the sparks of the insurrection. The exercise of violence on a young woman's body came as moral shock. Maybe it was not as dramatic as in the case of Mohammed's self-immolation in Tunisia, but it did came as shock because it resulted in, as affect literature puts, powerful indeterminacy. The questions in the minds were, what is going to happen? What happened to the woman in red? Did the protesters inside the park back down? Are we going to swallow what happened right there? In this sense, I would argue that this chaotic ambiguity led to an affective intensity, which was able to ramify through prepersonal affects and prior affective events. In simple words, the event began transcending its own boundaries.
In order to like understand or address my questions, that's what I identify as like the dynamic of power that occurred in Egypt between 2011 and 2013. So we know that many scholars argue that the stability of the regime was based on the divide and rule strategy. So they divided the opposition, probably co-opted one side and crushed the other side. This is not it maybe not still valid for after the uprising. And what I identified here is that this kind of the two actors, in order to rule, has to join together against another one. So if you look at 2011, secular and Islamists were together against, at that time, a Mubarak regime or Mubarak presidency. Otherwise, if you go clockwise, in 2012, Islamists and the army were together at expenses, excluding the seculars from sharing power or excluding secular from the democratic transition. And finally, in 2013, after the uprising in Egypt, secular and the army closed it together in order to get rid of Mubarak. So I wanted to understand what kind of dynamic get behind that. So we know that before the uprising, there were two main paradigms were competing and try to explain and were dominant in the literature. On one hand, we have the authoritarian resilience, which is arguing that the authoritarian regime were kind of, that they're really strong and there was very unlikely any overture. And they were considering civil society as a deposit society, not interested in politics, not involved in that. And the uprising proved that it was not true, for example, in the case of Egypt. Following the democratization process still is not being vindicated because we don't see any democracy coming from Egypt. What I like to consider is the concept of authoritarian upgrading by Edelman. However, he considered this process of upgrading from a ruling elite, from a ruling class. I would like actually to reverse this process and consider the role that civil society had in upgrading the authoritarianism. So in order to answer my questions again, I'm trying to look at how from the civil society this upgrading process can occur. So, and I think that Gramsci theory is particularly helpful in explaining this dynamic. So if we look at the concept of civil society in Gramsci, we can see that has a crucial dialectic relation within that. We have groups that compete each other either to establish an hegemony or to promote a counter-hegemony. So, and relevant in Gramsci are, for example, the concept of idea, the concept of ideology, and also the role that intellectuals plays in gathering those ideas, in gathering the interest and in develop class consciousness. And ultimately, in the formation of a historical bloc. So when this is come to the case of Egypt, I see that there was no formation. Like if the idea of this movement were really triggering a revolution, there was no formation of a clear historical bloc in order to promote this revolution, in order to trigger the revolution. And I see also the lack, to some extent, of organic intellectual. I referred at the beginning of the quote of Saleh Naguib. I don't think that that one can be really considered as an organic intellectual try to promote. I will interpret that as a traditional intellectual that at some point has been co-opted by the regime.
So, over the past decade, Christian populations in the Middle East have undergone severe trials, leading to the dramatic acceleration of their displacement and exile. Ancient Christian communities in Syria and Iraq have fled to safe havens within and outside their home countries. In Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and among the Palestinians, Christians also face numerous pressures. The departure of Christians from the Middle East undermines pluralism in a region transformed by demands for change. If the health of pluralism is measured by the Christian exodus, is there any hope for the future of reform? In spite of the ambivalence of established church hierarchies and elites, many Christians did participate in the Egyptian and Syrian Arab Spring protests. In the period of transition that ensued, Copts, and for particular Copts in Egypt, pursued pluralist strategies to represent their interests. These and similar efforts in Syria and Jordan quickly came to a halt with the collapse of Syria into civil war and the overthrow then of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt in summer of 2013. The crisis brought about by the Islamic State takeover of northern Syria and Iraq in summer 2014 has forced Christians into organizing merely to survive in small sanctuaries or in exile. Arab Christians seeking to represent their interests are left with few options. The Arab Spring highlighted the possibility of a new pluralist form of representation, only to be dashed by destabilization. Most Arab regimes continue to seek neo-Milli elite bargains with Christian leaders, which gain support among Christians who are fearful of a return to chaotic democratic transition. Even so, a struggling Christian civil society seeks the modernization of entrenched sectarian relationships. The unfinished project of the Arab Spring is the expansion of their opportunity to organize and to celebrate their differences through civil activism and community engagement. And so in this paper, I'm trying to survey Christian responses to the past 4 years of crisis in order to map the future of Christian interest representation. Popular and scholarly treatments of religion and politics in the Middle East often emphasize the dominant, if multiple, Islamic cultures that permeate the region. Until recently, the reality of cultural and religious pluralism has only been occasionally acknowledged. However, the destabilizing of Egypt and the Levant and the rise of extreme violent radicalism and the movements linked to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria and the so-called Islamic State have shone a light on the reality of social pluralism in those contexts. Among the various religious and ethnic minority communities in the Middle East are several Christian communities numbering up to 14 million. In most cases, these communities boast a historic presence that dates back to the earliest history of Christianity. As a result, many Christians describe themselves as truly indigenous, tracing their ancestry back to communities that predated the Islamic conquest. Christian controversies had divided many of these groups long before the rise of Islam. As a result, there is relatively little ecumenical unity among the Christians of the region, rendering them vulnerable to strategies that would isolate each Christian community in its national context. National churches then predominate throughout the Middle East. The largest group by absolute numbers is the Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt. Somewhere close to 95% of Egypt's population of 6 to 8 million Christians are Coptic Orthodox, and all Egyptian Christians are popularly known as Copts, a word that refers, of course, to the historic Byzantine name of Egypt. Proportionally, Christians have been the largest sectarian grouping in Lebanon as well, where they remain somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of the population. Lebanese Christians are divided by sect, but the historic importance of the Maronite Church provides it with a uniquely significant position as an influence on politics, in particular given the fact, of course, that the National Pact consigns the presidency to a Maronite. Lebanese Catholics of the Greek Catholic Rite are also prominent, as are Greek Orthodox and Armenians. Similar divisions apply among the Syrian Christian population of approximately 2 million. While the historic Christian community of Iraq is rooted in the ancient Church of the East, whose adherents refer to themselves as Assyrians, in a nod to the ancient northern Iraqi civilization, the majority of Iraqi Christians are divided among the Syriac Orthodox and Chaldean churches. Among Palestinians and Jordanians, there are likely around 400,000 Christians, divided among various Latin and Eastern Rite Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. History has divided, then, the Arab Christian population. But contemporary challenges to the faith have forced them to rethink their age-old divides. The modern ecumenical movement among the churches may be dated back to the foundation of the Middle East Council of Churches in 1974, but the preoccupation of the churches on local issues has limited its cooperation since that time. Added to this are the normal tensions among denominations over Protestant and Catholic evangelism among their historic churches, and there's been little desire to provide a united voice across the region speaking for Christian concerns. More recently, the growth of media initiatives and the attendant spread of television ministries and personalities has given new impetus to a feeling of regional solidarity among Christians. For example, Sat7, or satellite channel founded in 1996, provides religious programming by and for all of the denominations of Christians in the Middle East. Over recent years, there's been an uptick in the number of regional councils and events that gather the leaders of various churches and Christian organizations in the region. In October of 2010, the Roman Catholic Church summoned a synod to discuss the plight of Christians in the Middle East, focusing on the decline of the Christian population. In September of 2013, the King of Jordan hosted a very high-profile international research conference on the status of Christians amid the Arab Spring as well. A similar conference convened in Washington, D.C. in September of 2014 demonstrated some of the inherent difficulties of uniting efforts on behalf of Christians in the region when it gained headlines not so much for Christians looking to deal with their own concerns, but of course its politicized pro-Israel speech that was delivered by Republican Senator Ted Cruz. Despite efforts to try to address this, then, national churches predominate in the Middle East, and churches tend to form peak organizations of Christians that shape Christian life. In spite of nascent regional efforts then at expanding the influence of civil society, the dominant form of interest representation among Christians is this neo-Milli model in which church hierarchies forge direct relationships with the regime.
Circularity explains some of the Arab Spring's successes and also some of its impasses. It recognizes the complexity of networks, and the concept also reveals the nature of the revolutionary revival when it occurs and how it will occur. Theorizing transnational activism as an invocation of citizenship claims and capacities in terms of the geographies of circularity. That's what we seek to discuss today. I will be talking more about the theoretical framework, and Bessma will be talking more about the empirical evidence that reveals itself. So circularity as a way in which power is increased and self-knowledge is increased. So these are the two themes that are revealed. So one way in which the theme of circularity reveals itself is through the logistical cyber activism of people and the cultural bridges that occur when people invoke their citizenship rights and claims and negate Orientalist stereotypes about, for example, Arabs or Muslims. And dual citizenship can be a mechanism that acts as a bridge that can mobilize action. Dual citizenship and multiple claims of citizenship become the mechanism that move ideas from A to B to A, or A to B to C and back to A, and to circumvent states' power that seeks to control or track the diffusion of ideas and the networking of activists. Bessma is going to talk about a few empirical examples of this. A second way in which circularity is revealed is through the way in which local activists, transnational activists, for example, in the West, were able to encircle their own states or the states of their citizenship, the governments of their citizenship, and hold them accountable. They were able to almost democratically become a mechanism of accountability by asking the state to be true to its word. You are trying to export democracy. Are you actually fulfilling those promises? And so this encircling mechanism is a form of power. It goes from being a situation where the Muslim or the Arab or the Christian Arab subject is in Canada, for example, under the foot of stereotypes and invalidation and marginalization, to suddenly being one of power where they can ask the Canadian state to put their money where their mouth is, right? And then there's two other forms of circularity that we're talking about today. There's a number of them, but anyway, two today, in addition to the ones we've just spoken about. One is, and they manifest themselves in a kind of transversal peer-to-peer change in subjectivity via circulation. So, and I say subjectivity because I think we need to get beyond identity, because identity is a very difficult thing to pinpoint. It's a very messy concept, and one that's very contested. Whereas subjectivity, we know that it's connected to agency, it's connected to the mobilization of the political subject. So transversal changes in the mobilization of political subjects via peer-to-peer circulation. So this comes in two forms. One is the stirring through peer-to-peer contact of political agitation. So we have a subject that is politically agitated on some level, and the stirring of that agitation into a political activism, into an agency that's activated. And so this can be conceived of as a transmutation, a thickening of the subjectivity from one that is thin and passive to one that is thicker and more activated. And this activated subjectivity is engaged and mobilized, and is also the agent that stirs intercommunity conflict and intercommunity collaboration. And then a final way in which circularity can be mobilized or is mobilized is through the transformational, and I mean this literally, transformational full circle return of the Arab subjectivity or the Muslim subjectivity to its origins, to its homeland, and the citizenship claims that go along with that. So where someone may have been born in Canada but come from Syrian descent or come from Jordanian descent, Egyptian, suddenly this the circularity and the movement of ideas transforms the way they see of their home life. It's no longer a situation of Canadian Jordanian where the Canadian is privileged and the Jordanian is a side note, but instead there's an invocation of pride and connection to a context where there's stirrings of change, where there's a claim to dignity that people want to tap into and they want to make claim to.
So basically, as Melissa's pointed out, we've noticed some trends, and really this is based on desk research so far, so we would love to get more examples, and part of this is through our own observation. But as you can see, the basic premise that we have is really trying to get at, how did Arab transnationals shape the revolutionary ideas or participate in revolutionary movements in the Arab world during the Arab Spring. Now, I think we all can agree that a lot has changed since the euphoria of the first 6 months to perhaps first years, but we're really just focusing on that temporal period in our evidence. We would love to extend it, but I think that's kind of beyond the scope of this particular paper, but it doesn't take away from the reality that obviously things have evolved, let's put it that way. And I want to point out that we're adding to a literature on transnational activism that's not new. I mean, we all know that what was called diaspora politics, for example, is longstanding, whether it's lobbying, lawsuits, fundraising, protesting, voting, using Western media to your advantage. There's lots of ways that diaspora movements have always been active. But we do think there's something new. And the literature sort of suggests that internationalism, and the work of Taro is probably the most influential on this, is that this idea of internationalism, not internationalization, he's very clear, is that means there's more points of contest, there's more trigger points. Whether it's the fact that you can now use NGOs as a trigger point. You can use the subnational government as a trigger point. You can use the city level as a trigger point. That has, in effect, meant that transnationalism becomes heightened as a political possibility. Okay, so for us in trying to find out where have Arab transnationals been influential. And we really fix this mostly to the West because I think that's an important reality. We don't look at Arab transnationals, say, perhaps in Southeast Asia, their activity in the Gulf countries, which has a whole myriad of different perspectives and limitations, really focus mostly on the West. And some of the things that we saw, and based on some of the research of others as well, is that we saw that these activists were cultural brokers, right? I mean, Melissa really talked about this important point of being basically interlocutors. They were able to kind of transcend even in the Western media discourse. I mean, I remember very powerfully my own experience in doing some media myself that, people finally saw a new vision of what was the Arab, right? Even in our Western sense. It was beyond that sort of violent youth masses out there, the Arab street, right? That whole, notorious Arab street phenomena was now suddenly seen as, well, these are progressive kids that look just like us in Tahrir Square, demonstrating against, abusive authority. There was this de-orientalization of the image of the Arab protester. We also saw that a lot of the Arab transnationals were effective in making those bridges, right? Whether they were, we saw, Toronto Square, Dundas Square, Tahrir Square, right? There was work of some really great Egyptian young activists, many of them I know as personal friends, for example, who were speaking to Canadian-based media, and just that visual image of showing that, you see us, we are, integrated Canadians who represent the multicultural fabric of this society. Well, those in Tahrir are no different than us. And so they create this interesting cultural bridge. We also see very interesting work of activists who actually curate information, bringing what they know and read and hear on the ground and putting it online in a curated form. Some of you may find the work, I personally follow the work of people like the group of the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, right? I mean, they have done probably the most effective job in the West of tallying the exact body count, who died, what was the circumstances of their death. I mean, to really bring out the abuses of the Syrian regime. They play this really important role. Syria Deeply, if you watch that or follow their writings, they're often engaging, citizen journalists on the ground who write in an audience form in a very sort of New York Times kind of fashion. And one has to point out that both of these organizations are run by Arab transnational Syrian activists who are also raised or living in the West. Well, not an Arab source, but Brown Moses, for example, is another, interesting curated online form.